So this is the afternoon, the last afternoon that we've been waiting for, with lots of thoughts in our heads and time to start to crystallize them a little bit more and move forward with other and more challenges as to what we can do going ahead. So I am going to turn over to Robert Cowell, who's another one of our board members. I've neglected to say that Rebecca Francis this morning, who introduced our last speaker, was also one of our board members. And I think this is Robert, this is your turn to shine. So I'm going to turn it to you to introduce our speaker.
Hello, thank you, Patsy. Like Patsy said, I'm Robert Cowell. I'm coming from Newfoundland. I am on the board of directors and the executive director of St. John's Homestead, Inc. And it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Trevor Hancock today for Economics as if Wellbeing Mattered. Trevor made a bit of a critical error by letting us know he retired last year. So I think Malcolm and Patsy intend to work within an inch of his life over the next few years and get as much resource and knowledge as we can from Trevor. So just digging into the bio a bit there, Dr. Trevor Hancock is a public health physician and health promotion consultant and retired last year from his position as professor and senior scholar at the School of Public Health and Social Policy at the University of Victoria. His main areas of interest are population health promotion, the links between health and global ecological change in the Anthropocene, healthy cities and communities, public health, healthy public policy, healthy and green hospitals, health policy and planning, and health futurism. He is one of the founders of the now global Healthy Cities and Communities movement, originating the term healthy public policy. He has been described as one of the 10 best health futurists in the world. He was a senior editor for the editorial board of the Canadian Journal of Public Health from 2014 to 2018, and in 2015 was invited to join the editorial board for a new journal, Cities and Health. Since December 2014, Trevor has written a regular weekly column on population and public health for the Times Colonists, excuse me, the daily newspaper in Victoria. He was made an honorary life member of the Canadian Public Health Association in 1990 and an honorary fellow in the UK's Faculty of Public Health in 2015. In 2017, he was awarded the R.D. Dethrone Award, the CPHA's highest award, presented for outstanding contributions in the broad field of public health, as well as Lifetime Contribution Award from Health Promotion Canada. Considering how many times I just said health, I think we have a good man for the job here today. So I'm going to pass it over now to Trevor.
Thank you, and good morning. Well, it's good morning for me, folks, because I'm in Victoria and British Columbia, so it's 8:45 in the morning. But I guess from what Patsy just said, I'm the only thing standing between you and your final coffee break. So I'm going to be talking this morning about the topic of economics as if health mattered. And just while I'm starting to my share screen, I should probably explain that line about being one of the 10 best health futurists in the world. There are only 10 health futurists in the world, and I'm one of them, and one of my colleagues said that about me. So I just want to check, because I'm not seeing the green line around my screen. Are you seeing my screen?
Yep, you're good to go.
Okay, good. So I'm going to run through some stuff fairly quickly here, and the topic is economics as if well-being mattered. And of course, earlier today you heard from Brian Smale, particularly on the topic of well-being, so I won't have to do that. I should say the title, which is Economics as if Well-being Mattered, is a little more than a nod to this book from 1973, E.F. Schumacher's book, Small is Beautiful, Economics as if People Mattered. And that was a very influential book in my life, and started my interest in the relationship between economics and health, economics and well-being, economics and the planet. So I'm going to touch on what is well-being. I'm going to talk about what is wrong with our current system, and the notion of system is going to be a strong notion throughout this, and then talk about some of the impacts, and then spend a fair bit of time at the end talking about what we're beginning to see emerging as the notion of well-being and economics. I just want to acknowledge both what Trish Hennessy said on our first evening and what Brian Smale said earlier today, those two in particular. in part because they have said things that I therefore don't have to say if you have seen their presentations. And so I actually have dropped a bunch of slides out in the interest of time that really covers ground that they covered. But this is a central point, and it's one that I find increasingly useful and important. It actually comes out of systems engineering, but was picked up as an idea by an organization in the US called the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. And it's the notion that every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results it gets. So if you want to know what your system is designed to do, then you need to look at what results you get. And if you look at our current social and economic system, you'd have to say that it seems perfectly designed to create poverty and insecurity for millions of people, that it's perfectly designed to absurdly reward the rich and drastically heighten inequality, to ignore harm to people and communities, a point I'll return to, and to damage and even destroy the natural earth systems upon which we depend for our very lives, for our health and well-being. So, yes, there's other things you could point to. It's perfectly designed to raise levels of material wealth and all the rest of it. But it's these kind of negative impacts and their impacts in turn on well-being are what concern me. And of course, all of this harms health and well-being. So what is well-being? Well, we've had some discussion from Brian and others about it. This is a definition from the Office for National Statistics in the UK, because they've started to look at the idea of a well-being economy. And that is that we have to look beyond what we produce, the stuff, in other words, that we usually sort of seem to determine our success by the amount of stuff we have. The more stuff you have, the more successful you must have been in life. But in fact, they're saying we have to look beyond what we produce to areas such as health, relationships, education, skills, what we do, where we live, our finances, the environment, all of that. So that's then what's behind the idea of well-being. And of course, that's very much what you heard from Brian Smale this morning in terms of the Canadian Index of Well-being. And one of the important things they said about well-being in their 2016 report is that well-being is a system of interconnected systems. And so this notion that we've got a system that produces certain results, whether they're the ones we want or not, you can see some of the elements of that system here. So health, democratic engagement, community vitality, environment. If you think about the definition that the UK Office of Statistics offered, same sets of systems very much that are interconnected. If you look, and we'll come back to this, at New Zealand's 12 domains of well-being, which underpins their new work on a well-being budget. I apologize for the quality of this, but it was blown up from a much smaller original image. But you get the point again, that here is a list of domains of well-being, and again, many of the same ones that you saw in the previous couple of slides being referenced. So well-being is not simply my personal well-being. Well-being is a system of systems. And so we have to ask the question, is our current system designed to create well-being? And how well is it doing that? Not just producing stuff. And if, in fact, it's also producing a lot of very negative things, such as massive levels of inequality and massive levels of environmental destruction, both of which undermine our well-being, then we clearly have a problem, and we clearly need to change the system because it's not working for us. So I've touched on this already. What is wrong with the current system? I've touched on its impacts on people and communities, but those are largely excluded. I'll come back again to this point. Inequality, I would say, in the current system is actually baked in to the system. It is inherent in and an inevitable outcome of the system. And ecological harm is likewise built in. It is an inevitable outcome of the system. And to a large extent, those baked in, those built-in impacts are because people and communities are largely excluded, as is the environment, from our determination of the system and its impacts. So my comment there is that the next 10 slides are hidden. I have a larger deck, which is the deck you have in the resource kit, but in the interest of time today, and because a lot of this ground was covered by Trish Hennessy and to some extent by Brian, I've hidden the slides from this presentation, but you can see them if you check the main deck. So what are some of the impacts of all of this on well-being? Well, first of all, inequality kills and inequality sickens. And there is a notion in the US, particularly in the US, that's come out of the US, of diseases of despair. And they are the diseases related to drug use and alcohol use and suicide. And they've all been rising, particularly in some segments of the population there. A second set of impacts is that we are undermining the ecological determinants of health. And they have within that a number of growing mental well-being concerns, things such as climate anxiety and eco-grief, which are very appropriate. We shouldn't look on them as a problem. They are an appropriate response to a problematic situation. And as a result, well-being is being sacrificed. Some of you, I'm sure, will know, I hope all of you, of the WHO Commission on the Social Determinants of Health, which almost 10 years ago now issued its final report. And in there, one of their key findings is social injustice is killing people on a grand scale. And I make the point at the bottom that it's not just killing them, but it's making them sick on a grand scale. And that includes mental well-being as well as physical well-being. This is work from Wilkinson and Pickett's book from a decade or so ago, The Spirit Level, just over a decade ago. And what they did here was this is for high income countries. What they first showed is that GDP per capita, sort of stuff, if you like, wealth per capita, is pretty much unrelated to this index of 7 or 10 different social and health problems. But if you look at the level of inequality, then what you find is that the higher the level of income inequality on the right, the worse things are going up the left-hand scale. And at the top, of course, is the USA. Canada, pretty much as always, is right in the center. And down at the bottom, you have the lowest level of income and the best index of social and health outcomes in the Nordic countries and Japan. So inequality is a problem, not just in absolute terms, whether or not you have enough to eat and drink and house yourself, but in relative terms. And it's this level of relative well-being, or inequality that matters, relative wealth. WHO in 2014 specifically said that risk factors for many common mental disorders are heavily associated with social inequalities. The greater the inequality, the higher the inequality in risk. And so this is a key point about the impacts. And how does this happen? Well, more recently, Pickett and Wilkinson 2 years ago produced a new book called the Inner Level. So their first book was called The Spirit Level. This is called The Inner Level and deals much more with how does inequality manifest itself in physical and mental disorders or problems. And so here we have some explanation of that. They argue in their book that unequal societies trigger status insecurity and multiple anxieties. Some people become demoralized and depressed, others become narcissistic and self-aggrandizing, so you can only show your status and improve it by having more stuff and becoming, sort of, I call this the Trump pathology. And nearly everyone outcomes, more likely to self-medicate with drugs and alcohol and fall prey to consumerism to improve their self-presentation. This was in an article, a long article and interview with Pickett and Wilson. And then we have a comment from Achim Steiner, who is the executive director of the UN Human Development Agency, that inequality is about more than just income. This was from last year's Human Development Report. Too often, he said, inequality is framed around economics and fed and measured by the notion that making money is the most important thing in life. But in fact, inequality is about much more than just money. We have to look at the deep social norms that are embedded within our history and culture. So when we talk about reducing inequality, it's not just a matter of spreading income around, it's looking at the deeper issues. And what we're seeing now with the racism and all of the concerns around that, that is another expression of that inequality, which is partly about income, but clearly about much more than income. I've mentioned this already. This is from the work of Case and Dethrone. Dethrone being a Nobel Prize-winning economist, I should add, in America. And they have been talking for some time and most recently written a book about the deaths of despair in America, which has been among middle-aged American whites. And it's almost entirely found among those without a bachelor's degree and is mostly due to one of three factors: suicide, drug overdoses, and alcoholic liver disease, which they call the deaths of despair. And that's what they argue is happening here. This is in many ways, these are Trump's voters. These are people who lost a lot in the obsession with growth and globalization and outsourcing that we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years. And they are the victims of that, as the Rust Belt has disappeared, the jobs have disappeared, and so on. And they put this down to, here are some of the factors that are behind the diseases of despair in America. It's more extreme there, but we can see some of the same thing here: declining wages, low rates of job creation for those without a degree, and the jobs they do get are part-time, outsourced, insecure, a low level of unionization for wage and salary workers, which has actually gone down in the US, and compared to places such as Iceland or Norway or even Canada, where it's currently almost 3 times the rate that it is in the US. And of course, with that goes loss of benefits as well. So people don't have health insurance in the US. And you can begin to see why you'd have diseases of despair and why it would be far more widespread in America. Not that it's not happening here, it is, but we have a much better social safety net that cushions people from some of this. Then on top of that, we're seeing the impacts of what are being called climate anxiety and eco-grief. And this was last year, was it last year or 2 years ago? We had Ashley Consolo speaking at the Atlantic Summer Institute about the health and particularly the mental well-being impacts of climate anxiety and climate change. And she talked about the fact that it represents these things, climate change, and in particular the broader global ecological changes that we call for convenience the Anthropocene. They represent an existential threat to our communities and societies and civilizations. And of course, existential threats evoke anxiety and grief, and that's normal and natural, and you'd expect that. And all of that is driven by these sorts of differences. This was a chart that Brian Smales showed earlier, although this one, I'm sorry, I just noticed I mistakenly put in an earlier chart, but it shows much the same pattern. This only goes to 2010. My slide title says 2014. I put the wrong, an older figure in here. But the point is that our GDP, which is in many ways a level of measurement of stuff, has gone up, and wealth has gone up, but our index of well-being has not. And in fact, they made the point in their last report that the gap is actually widening. So we look like we should be doing better, but we're actually feeling worse, or at least we're not feeling anywhere near as good as the economic indicators suggest we should, for the sort of reasons that I was just outlining. So in that report, the last Canadian Index of Wellbeing report, they said that it's time to focus on the quality of our lives. The divergence in the Canadian Index of Wellbeing and GDP tells us emphatically that we have not been making the right investments in our people and in our communities, and I would also add in protecting our planet. And we've not been doing it for a long time, and we need to focus more on the quality of our lives, which of course is really the theme of my presentation. So to get different results, we must change the social and economic system, and we need to put well-being at the heart of policy development, which again is a recommendation that comes out of that Canadian Index of Wellbeing National Report from 2016. So that's where we need to be going. So what would, in particular, a well-being economics system look like? And that really in many ways means a social system too. Well, this is not exactly a new idea. So this was an article from a friend and colleague of mine, Peter Draper at Guy's Hospital in London, 1977, in the Royal Society of Health Journal, writing about the relationships between health and wealth, some of the issues that we're talking about here. And you saw earlier E.F. Schumacher's 1973 book, Small is Beautiful, which was also about this. So these are ideas that have been around for at least 50 years in what I would call their modern version. They are, of course, older than that. Marxism in many ways was a critique, an economic critique of the same issues that we're talking about today. This was, I actually had a chapter in a book that came out of this, but this is a mini version, a report called Health, Wealth and the New Economics from an organization called the Other Economic Summit, which later grew into being the New Economics Foundation. So they would convene every year at the same time as the Global Economic Summit and hold a sort of alternative economic summit. And you'll notice the subtitle, An Agenda for a Healthier World. Note, this was 1985. So here we're talking 35 years ago. And then most recently, and some of you can all get a hold of this, I did a report for the National Collaborating Center for Healthy Public Policy, which was published as it's described as an interview. It isn't really an interview. But this was published just in May of this year, and it's an introduction to ecological economics for the public health field. So you can get that, download it free from the website for the National Collaborating Center for Healthy Public Policy, which you can see their website at the top of that page there. So I'm going to talk very quickly about some of the key points that are in that report about what is new and what are some of the key aspects of ecological economics. So multiple forms of capital, why growth is a bad idea, why GDP is a bad indicator, why selfishness is the wrong guiding principle, and our need to dethrone the economy and make well-being the center of our societal strategies rather than economic growth. This puts it very simply, the Worldwide Fund for Nature in 2014, ecosystems sustain societies that create economies. It does not work the other way around. So we've tended to act as though the economic domain was the most important domain. It's a subset. Actually, the economy is a social construct. We created it. We can change it any way we like. It's simply a social construct. It doesn't exist as some thing out there beyond our ability to manage and control. And all of that is subject to the limits of the planet. We have one planet. We have to live within its limits, and we are not, as I'm sure you know. There is a notion out there also of different forms of capital. So again, we tend to talk about capital as if it was manufactured and financial capital, economic capital, if you like, as if that was the only form of capital at the center. But again, that is nested within our social and human capital, and that in turn is nested within our natural capital. And so one of the points I make when I talk to business people, and I don't get to very often, but when I do, is you're not a real capitalist if all you do is maximize manufactured and financial capital, particularly when you do so at the cost of reducing social capital or human capital or natural capital. That if that's how you are operating, you're a fake capitalist. You're not a real capitalist because you're not maximizing all forms of capital at the same time, which is what we have to do. And notice that within this model, economic capital again is subservient to the social and the natural. And those are the most important forms of capital and the human capital. So this is the point I just made about fake capitalism. I won't repeat myself. Then there's the notion of growth. Every government seems to want growth. Every society wants growth. Every business wants growth. 3.5% growth. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Well, no, it wouldn't. 3.5% growth means a doubling time of 20 years. So for a child born this year, if they were to live 80 years or so, which is roughly our lifespan, our life expectancy at the moment, the economy would be 16 times larger than it is today. Does anyone seriously believe this is possible? Especially when you have the rest of the planet trying to have the kind of life we have. I mean, this is crazy. In fact, not only is it crazy, but Kenneth Boulding, who was a former president of both the American Economic Association and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, way back, this was 1973, he said this in testimony to the US Congress. Anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. We really do need to rethink the very fundamentals that underlie our economic model and our societal system, because they are beyond problematic. They are an existential threat. Our economy, as currently constructed, is an existential threat to humanity. That's why we have to change it. The notion of GDP. GDP is a really, really bad way to guide society, guide the economy. And developed in the 1930s, and one of its key architects, Simon Kuznets, back in 1934, speaking to the US Congress, said, quote, "The welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measure of national income," which is what GDP is. That was not heard, and that remains to this day a problem. You listen to the radio, what do you hear? Did the GDP go up? Did it go down? Did it go up enough? Did it go down? You don't hear the Canadian Index of Wellbeing being reported, which is what we should be reporting. We're guided by the wrong measures. Here's some of the reasons why. You want to maximize GDP? One way to do it actually is to go out and burn a really large building to the ground, because the economic activity you generate from burning that building down is massive. You can also do it by selling tobacco and then treating the illnesses, because both add to GDP. Clearly, this is stupid. You can then harm the environment by mining it, by cutting the trees down, by damaging the ocean, by overfishing, and then you can spend a whole lot of money trying to clean it up. Both of those add to GDP. On the other hand, GDP doesn't measure a whole bunch of things that do make a difference in our lives: volunteering, caring for family or neighbors. Because they're not monetized, they're not captured. So just forget about GDP. It's a bad, bad measure. We need to get off that measure very quickly. All of these sorts of activities that grow GDP by harming the planet or people or communities is what Herman Daly called uneconomic growth. Then we have selfishness. So the underlying principle of our current sort of dominant economic model, which is neoliberalism, is to put yourself first. Other people don't matter. The environment doesn't matter. And to see that inequality is simply an inevitable consequence, and it's an incentive to try harder. Well, we've seen the consequence of putting selfishness at the center of our economic system, and yet that's what we've been doing for the last 40 years or so. So we need to dethrone the economy. The Minister of Finance should not be the most important minister in the government. The Minister of Wellbeing should be, actually the whole cabinet should be the Minister of Wellbeing. The whole government should be a well-being government. The economy exists to serve us. It's not that we exist to serve the economy. And we've got that ass backwards, and we need to change that. So it's time to put people and the planet first. This is imperative if we're ever going to make the transition to a sustainable, just, and healthy society, which is not our current path. And this is a profound suggestion, it's a radical suggestion, but if we don't come to grips with this, you talk about the well-being of children and youth, they are going to be harmed by our current course, and we have to change course, and we have to do so very rapidly. Of course, it challenges the very heart of our current system. Growth in consumption, we have to recognize, is not the solution, it's actually the problem. We need a new, different form of economic system. We need to build all five forms of capital at the same time. We need new measures of progress, such as other ones in addition to the Canadian Index of Wellbeing are the Genuine Progress Indicator, the Happy Planet Index, anything that goes beyond our current system. Because we don't have a system that is fit for purpose in the 21st century. What sort of economy could meet the goal of achieving good health and a good quality of life for everyone while living within the biophysical and ecological constraints of this one small planet that is our home? As Tim Jackson said, our economics today is not fit for purpose. Herman Daly, one of the pioneers of ecological economics, said enough should be the central concept in economics, where enough means sufficient for a good life. Imagine moving to a society where the guiding principle was enough rather than growth. That's what we need to be doing. That's certainly what we need to be talking about. This is a couple of examples of that. So this is a book on steady state economics by Rob Dietz and Dan O'Neill. Dan O'Neill is actually a Canadian teaching at Leeds University in the UK. Enough is Enough is the title of the book. An economy where the goal is better lives, not more stuff. And then something that perhaps many of you have seen in recent years, Kate Raworth's notion of donut economics, where you have to have a big enough economy to lay down a social foundation, which is the inner dark green circle. All of the things within that are the things we need to meet. And then not so big that you damage all of the environmental determinants of health. So she calls this the donut, with a social foundation and an ecological ceiling. So we need to create within that what she calls a safe and just space for humanity. And this is what I just showed you, put into words. I won't go through it word by word, but a social foundation of well-being that no one should fall below, and an ecological ceiling of planetary pressure we should not go beyond. That's what we have to do. And she says that such an economy is both regenerative and distributive. One of the things about saying you can't have growth is if the economy can't grow, the only way that people who don't have enough can get enough is for those of us who have too much to have less. So we have to redistribute within a fixed size of pie. We can't hold out the promise to those who don't have enough that, well, we'll just grow the economy and you'll end up having more, even though it'll still be a pitiful amount. And this was an article, I didn't have time to go into it, that showed that mathematically that left to its own devices, a free market economy leads inevitably to oligarchy, with one person or very few people owning everything. Does that sound familiar? That's where we are. The economics says that's inevitably where we go. And they then wrote, this is a professor of mathematics, Boghossian, only a carefully designed mechanism for redistribution can compensate for the natural tendency of wealth to flow from the poor to the rich in a market economy. So we need a redistributive and a regenerative economy. We have to regenerate communities. We have to regenerate people's well-being. We have to regenerate natural capital and the planet's well-being, if you like. And so that takes us to New Zealand, where they have committed recently, within the last couple of years, to a well-being budget. We want, said the Minister of Finance, a well-being focus to drive the decisions we make about government policies and budgets. This means looking beyond traditional measures such as GDP to a wider set of indicators of success. And so this is the model that they are using. You will notice here specifically a reference to the 4 capitals: natural, social, human, and financial and physical. And so that same model of capitals, they just combine financial and physical, the same one that you saw in a couple of the earlier models. And then down the right-hand side there, something I showed to you earlier, the 12 domains of current well-being that they are including in their work. And so when we talk about an economics of well-being, not only is it imperative that we create it, but we have examples such as here in New Zealand where countries are beginning to think about it. The OECD is looking at alternative ways of measuring well-being and measuring economics as well, and a number of other nations are. So from the point of view of, if you like, human capital, which is, they say in this, the capabilities and capacities of people to engage in work, study, recreation and social activities, including skills, knowledge, physical and mental health, this is where we need to be going. And so this is the basis of their 2019 budget, the new priorities. And I want to draw your attention to the bottom one, that one of their priorities is supporting mental well-being for all New Zealanders with a special focus on under 24-year-olds. This is one of 5 priorities for the New Zealand budget based on an economics of well-being. It speaks directly to the topic of this conference. It speaks directly to where we need to go to create an economics of well-being. And with that, I will stop and throw it open to questions. A couple of words to live by to conclude, not new ideas. Cicero, 2,000 years ago, let the good of the people be the supreme law. And more recently, Thomas Jefferson, a couple of hundred years ago, the care of human life and happiness, and I would add the well-being of the planet, and not their destruction, is the first and only legitimate object of good government. So what business are we in as a government? What sort of economy would get us there? If we make it an economics of well-being with a society focused on well-being, we will be in a much better place and go in a very different direction. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Trevor. That was fantastic. And we do have a few questions that have come up online. Some of them, you guys that have asked questions that you no longer see anymore, I think they were covered, and so they may have been removed as covered. So I'll start off with one here now from the chat. What support and role does environmental law and environmental rights play into the model you're discussing?
Well, thank you. Environmental law, and particularly the notion of environmental rights, is absolutely key to this. So one of the other interesting things, for example, that's happened in New Zealand is based on the Maori relationships with the land. They have started to provide, to recognize rivers and areas of land as persons in law. And that, of course, changes everything. And so the whole notion that a river is a person that has rights, or an area of land, Te Ureware, which used to be a national park and is now a Maori-run land area, has rights represented by a board that looks after them and protects the rights of that river or that piece of land. The notion that other species have a right to exist, I might draw the line at the smallpox virus, or perhaps these days the COVID virus, but in broad terms, other species have a right to exist. The planet has rights. There are moves underfoot to establish ecocide as a crime against humanity, to hold people accountable for the damage that is done. So in all of those areas, yes, I think there's a tremendous place for environmental law and for recognizing interspecies rights and the rights of rivers and ecosystems and the planet as a whole.
I'm sorry, can you just clarify? When did New Zealand make this shift of recognizing the rivers and land as persons?
Oh, hi, Samantha. I've been
Hi.
following interventions. I much appreciate them. Thank you. Within the last 2 or 3 years, and I was actually in New Zealand a year and a half ago for a big international conference I was speaking at on health promotion, and they had a presentation from the chair of the Maori chair of the board of Te Orawera, which was very powerful. It should be available on video from that IUHPE conference, but it was done within the last 3 or 4 years, I think, maybe a bit longer.
Well, thank you very much. I am definitely going to check that out further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Trevor, another one here from the Q&A. Hello. How can we implement such ideology in a world where capitalism and growth is what matters? Is there a feasible plan or structure to change the actual paradigms toward people's well-being?
Well, I wouldn't say there's a strategy. I think I organize something locally called Conversations for a One Planet Region. And what we're trying to do is to get people talking about this, because right now this is barely on the agenda. Now we do have, as it turns out, a wonderful opportunity as a result of COVID, that there's been a lot of talk about building back better. Now, I wrote a column couple of months ago when Trudeau was talking about the Canadian economy would come roaring back, saying, no, we don't want to roar back to what we had before. That would be a huge mistake. That economy is taking us in the wrong direction. But we have an opportunity to bounce forward. So there's two notions of resilience. Resilience as bouncing back to where we were before. But if where you were before is a problem, you don't want to bounce back to what you had before. Then there's the notion of bouncing forward to a different and better future. So you've seen probably a lot of briefs coming out of the social justice and environmental movement in particular about building back better in ways that create a more just, more sustainable, more healthy future. So those notions are beginning to be talked about, finally. I also think we have to actually do some ridicule. You have to say, I love that quote from Kenneth Boulding. Anyone who thinks indefinite growth in a finite system is possible is either a madman or an economist. I think that's a great quote to be using. I think that, in a sense, ridiculing people, telling our present sort of capitalist leaders that they're fake capitalists. They're really not capitalists because they're only creating one form of capital instead of 5. So a combination of certainly a lot of conversation about this, which is why I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you about it, but also some ridicule, some humor, some pointing to and finding the examples, such as New Zealand, but they're not alone, of where this can be done. Looking at, for example, the very clear gap between GDP and the Canadian Index of Wellbeing. Surely that should raise a whole lot of public discussion about just what are we doing here and why. And then I think certainly bringing in the voices of young people, if you say, look, we know we can't grow the economy 16 times in your lifetime. This is insane. How do you and how do we work together create a very different way of going forward? So I think, first of all, though, conversation everywhere at every level. It shouldn't just be happening in conferences, and it shouldn't just be happening in think tanks. It needs to be a widespread public discussion about alternative ways forward.
Thank you very much. We got time for a couple more. There's still a couple more questions there. And I did catch myself drinking a Perrier and realized it looked like I was drinking a Heineken. So I just want to let everybody know. Yes, I enjoyed it.
You don't know what's in this mug either.
That's the way that I should have went. Next one up. Can a circular economy accommodate a basic level of growth for social political stability without overshooting climate and ecological targets? And if so, how?
Well, I think that they're somewhat similar, but the notion of a circular economy partly is based on a circular industrial system. So we tend to have a linear throughput of materials. You mine something or create something out of raw materials, and raw materials all come from the earth. Remember, they're all the planet. All of our, we talk in our report for CPHA about the ecological determinants of health: air, water, food, materials, fuels. They all come from nature. They don't get made by humans out of nothing. And we take them, we use them, and then we push them out the far end as waste, and that's it. That's a linear economy. We need a circular economy where the wastes become the feedstock for another cycle of use. And so that's partly what's meant by a circular economy, kind of closed economy. The other thing is, what is it you do want to grow? So we can't grow the economy if the growth in the economy means a growth in material consumption, because there's just not enough stuff on the planet and not enough biocapacity to do that. For everyone, if everyone lived the way we live in Canada, we need 4 more planets. We don't have 4 more planets. So, but you can't have continued growth. In fact, you have to limit the size of the pie and then redistribute within it. But what you do want is growth in human development, growth in social cohesion, growth in environmental capacity or natural capacity, call it what you will. So how do we grow human and social and natural capital, and what sort of economy enables us to do that? So those are the things we do want growth in. They don't have to be reflected in a growth in material consumption and wealth in that sense.
Thank you very much, Trevor. I think that is our time. I found it fantastic as always, and I really appreciate all your input and all your knowledge that you brought to the table today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, guys. I think we're heading on to the next session now. Patsy, there you are.
Here I am. I just want to thank you once again. I love hearing you speak, and I love being challenged by your thinking, and so glad that you're on board with us, Trevor, and helping us, guiding the program forward as a member of our planning committee, and also sharing your thoughts and your knowledge and your research. So I really appreciate that. Thank you so much, Robert. That's been great to have you as our moderator. And Trevor, I will send you, there are a few more questions here. I don't know if you are a lover of Whova yet, but if you are, there are some questions still in our Q&A on the Whova site, and if not, I can send you the questions.
I can check them. I have the Hoover open. And I must say, it's always been a pleasure working with you folks, which is why I keep coming back year after year.
Thank you so much.
Oh, it's pretty great. Thank you. So it's now time to move on to our next session.